thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have here today about ransomware. We're hearing it in the news. It's constantly on LinkedIn. And I think that we need to learn a little bit more about where it's coming from and all different aspects of it. We've got some great guests today who are going to share their thoughts in regards to ransomware and provide some tips and so on. But I think it would be really great to just start off with some introductions. So let's get going. So Megan, why don't you go ahead and do a quick little intro and tell us a little bit about your career and what you're doing today.
Sure, thanks Rob, and thanks again for including me in the conversation. Delighted to be here and to be alongside these distinguished gentlemen. So my name is Megan Stiefel. I currently serve as the Global Policy Officer at a nonprofit called the Global Cyber Alliance. We work to reduce cybersecurity risk by making free resources available to a range of audiences, really any audience, but particularly we focus on organizations and entities who are kind of left behind by the current market situation. So that's why we place the emphasis on free. And we really focus on operational tools. So looking at how do you do something as opposed to you should do something. I joined GCA about 2.5 years ago. Prior to that, I was also at a nonprofit leading a cybersecurity project. And prior to that, I was fortunate to spend about a decade in government at the Department of Justice in the National Security Division, and worked both counterterrorism investigations related to something at the time that was called countering terrorist use of the internet. I have, in my prior life, appeared before and practiced in front of the FISA court, and was fortunate also to spend some time at the computer crime section at DOJ, and ended my DOJ career as a detail lead to the White House and the National Security Council. So it's great to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks for joining us. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to go over to Guillaume.
Guillaume, yes, thank you. So my name is Guillaume. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Defendify, which is a banking as a service provider in Canada. We essentially build all the technology you need to offer banking products. So of course, security is super important in that kind of environment. And I also make training through my company called Caffeine Security that I provide through Pluralsight. And in my career, I like to alternate between working as a practitioner, like I'm doing at Synaptic or was doing in the past running security at Nuance, and working in the security industry. So I can, when I'm working on a security product, like I was at Optics, I have hands-on experience on protecting actual companies. So I like to alternate between both. I've done plenty of incident response as well, and suffered the burn from ransomware and ransomware adjacent issues, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. We might tag you later to share a little bit about some of those experiences too. Over to you, Bob.
Hi, I'm Bob Gorley. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of OODA LLC. OODA is an acronym. It stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. This is a famous military strategy that is also a good way to describe what bad guys do in our networks. They get into our networks and they don't come with just a checklist. They look around and they make decisions and they do things like a fighter pilot would. They observe, orient, decide, and act. And we defenders need to do the same thing more often. So that's why we named the company that. We're a consultancy, and what we do is we help organizations, usually large organizations, reduce their risk by better architectures, better plans, policies, procedures. We do red teaming to test those architectures. And we're also members of the community. So we write a lot and try to give back when we can. And I would also say that I'm a huge fan of the Global Cyber Alliance and the stuff that Megan does. They're great teachers, and I try to be a fast learner of what they do.
Well, at the end of the presentation, we're going to share some free resources with everybody. And I think that everyone here has brought a few of those. So I'm looking forward to that. But to just set the stage a little bit, I think we should begin with just the conversation about, what is ransomware? I think the majority of people here who are joining us today probably know what it is. But in the end, it's a type of malware that's designed to block access to IT systems and files and so on. And it uses encryption to do that. And what happens there is the attackers are demanding a ransom in order to provide you the decryption code, key, whatever we want to call it, so that you can get your files back. In many cases, it might pop up on Windows on one machine or multiple machines. In most cases, it's designed to move laterally and shut down entire systems if it can. And sometimes there's even instructions included so that you can communicate with the attackers, because you know, they want happy customers and they want to make sure that they get their payments and things done as well. Now, some interesting statistics that I was reading the other day that I wanted to share from Cybercrime, our friends at Cybercrime Magazine, is that, you know, they're expecting that, you know, by the end of 2021, that the global ransomware cost is going to be about $20 billion, which is pretty significant. But more significant is their prediction on 2031, and their number is 265 billion. So, you know, moving from 20 billion to 265 billion. They also stated that they believe that you'll see a rate of attack at every 2 seconds at an organization, which is pretty significant. So just to start off, I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit, because maybe we can nail it down. But, you know, who are causing these attacks that we're seeing here against companies and organizations and the government here in the US and in Canada and so forth? Megan, do you want to take that one first for me?
Sure. So I think, you know, at this point, we see, like so many other types of cybercrime and cyber attacks, although that's a bugaboo word in my dictionary that we say for a discrete set of attacks, a range of actors, but most notably lately, it's been what we think to be largely criminal groups, and largely criminal groups operating or associated with Russia and former countries formerly under the USSR. And I think that the open question is whether or not these criminal groups are acting on behalf of, or kind of with the tacit knowledge of, under the direction of and control of, in this case, the Russian government. There are others, and I'm sure my colleagues will highlight some of the other actors around this space. But I think that for us, and I guess it's a little bit early to share this detail, but I was a co-chair of the ransomware task force that issued a report at the end of April. And one of the things that we highlighted there is the need for there to be collective action to really counter this idea of safe havens. And so we think of some of these countries, whether they be Russia or its neighboring states, who know that these groups are operating out of their jurisdictions and kind of refuse to be helpful in trying to mitigate and investigate the types of activities that they're undertaking.
Right. And we don't have the ability to go in there and stop those things, you know, on our behalf. Bob, any thoughts on that? Any other threat actors that you'd like to share that you believe?
I do. And I would also like to say, for context, I remember years and years and years and years ago, and maybe many of you do too, ransomware used to be something pretty easy to get rid of. It was almost a joke. It was things you could laugh at. What do these guys think they're trying to do? Well, 15 years ago, maybe it was a minor thing, but people started paying the ransom. So the bad guys start improving what they do to the point where it is this serious pandemic today. And I mention that because that means it's going to keep evolving, because, you know, there's financial motive, and it is extremely serious today. And another thing that has evolved is the organizations themselves. There are many bad guy organizations that have the ability to do a ransomware attack end to end. Everything they need to conceptualize and change the malware that's out there and target an organization, hack in, and then extract the money. But increasingly, we're seeing an ecosystem style attack where it's multiple separate actors that focus on what they're the best at. And then they exchange money through affiliate programs. So they're more agile and more sophisticated and more trained. So it's not just a single criminal group, it's an ecosystem of multiple criminal groups acting together.
Excellent. Guillaume, any thoughts from your side? Anything to add there?
I would just like to highlight that, yes, like traditional, when we think of ransomware, we think of something that's going to encrypt your files, and then there's an extortion portion of it, which is you got to pay to get the files back. But more and more, we're seeing different types of attacks, including now leaking the data and threatening to release it. So I think that's a change in the operating model. And I think that while it's very important for some people, some organization to know a lot about who the different attackers are, you know, obviously, if you're trying to decide on policy, that makes a huge impact. But for most companies, I think it's more important to know what the different tactics are than necessarily who the attackers are, because everyone's a target. It's not like only healthcare is a target or only financial institutions. So for most companies with I would say a lower level of security maturity, it's more important to know how things are going to happen rather than who's going to perpetrate the crime.
Right. And we've definitely seen when you're talking about specific organizations, the smaller organizations are definitely a key target today. It's not just about the enterprise organizations you read about in the news every day. There's small companies. You know, we just read about a really small business, a little veterinarian clinic right here in Maine that got hit with ransomware, and it was devastating to their business. I think interesting, and there's already some questions that are coming into. And by the way, Megan, thank you for sharing the article right in the chat. So if anyone wants to get that source, it's right there. But let's talk a little bit about how these attacks are being successful. We know that if we look at an SMB organization, you know, they have antivirus and firewalls and maybe some email spam systems in place, but ransomware is still being launched even successfully in enterprise organizations who might have even more mature, you know, cybersecurity programs in place. Guillaume, do you want to take this first? You know, how are they getting through those types of controls?
So there's a few different ways, right? Like I would say the big wave of ransomware we had, I don't know, around like 2015, 16, was a lot of just the malware itself spreading through different vulnerabilities and then spreading laterally once it gets into a company, right? So the malware gets executed on one computer, could be through phishing or some, you know, browser vulnerability or whatever. That part is not that important. But then it managed to get credentials from memory on that workstation and then try to connect to everything else it could reach, elevate privileges, and eventually maybe get an account that's powerful enough that it could just lock everything in the company at once. But there usually wasn't much of a like a manual step to it. It was mostly just like an approach where we try to get as much volume and it's going to work in some places and things are going to spread. Of course, we had a few examples like NotPetya, which was technically not ransomware, right? Like more of a wiper that pretended to be ransomware, and WannaCry that also spread over the internet through Windows vulnerabilities that were well known but not necessarily patched. But what we see more and more is ransomware is it's a good business model to make money, right? So they can afford to have a little bit more manual intervention. So you have almost like penetration testers that work for these groups that will try to get that initial foothold into the environment. So you can't really protect from ransomware the same way you would before, just thinking that it's just like dumb malware using the same ways of spreading around. There is much more of a manual interaction aspect to it nowadays.
Yeah. Anyone else want to share some thoughts onto why, you know, some of these antivirus, firewall, traditional controls just isn't enough?
Well, I would say that you know, the community has come together under the leadership of Mitre to establish this Mitre attack framework, which kind of documents a lot of adversary tactics and techniques and procedures, including all of the ways that bad guys can get their initial access into an enterprise. There are 9 ways that bad guys get initial access to an enterprise. All 9 of those are used to plant malware also, or potentially can be used. Of course, the most famous, widely known as phishing attacks, but there's 8 others. And another point I'd want to make is that I mentioned these criminal organizations are working as part of an ecosystem now. So there are some groups that specialize just in getting that initial access. I'm going to get initial access, and then I'll hand that off to another company, another bad guy company. And for that, I would like a 10% of any of the gain that you get from this. So that kind of specialization means that some bad guys don't have to worry about how the malware works and where to place it and all that. They just get the initial access. A bad thing.
Right. You know, we did another webinar with Rob Kanaki, who's one of our advisors, and he was sharing with us, you know, a little bit around where you're going with, Bob, is that, you know, there's a lot of testing that's occurring with these criminal groups. So they're testing against traditional technology, whether that's your email spam system or your endpoint protection solutions you have in place, and before they're launching their attacks. And if they find ways to get around them, then they can be really, really successful. So yeah, there's obviously a bunch of different ways. One of the questions that just got posed by someone who's joining us here is saying, any recommendations in regards to, you know, ensuring that backups are set up properly here in the event of a ransomware attack?
Speaking from experience, I would say that people are a little bit too optimistic in what they think the worst case scenario is. So you see a lot of disaster recovery plans that don't really start from the real worst case scenario. So I think that's what you have to start with. Assume that everything that could be wiped was wiped, right? Like it's encrypted, you don't want to pay the ransom, or maybe it was a wiper, not real ransomware, or for whatever reason, you can't get it back. And so there's a few things. You might have backups, but how fast can you restore them? I think that's a component that people have to take into account, which traditionally maybe we didn't, because you think, oh, we're almost never going to use that. And certainly we're not going to have to restore everything at the same time. Well, you might have to. So speed of restoring is important, but assume someone has all the administrative credentials to your entire environment. Could they delete the backups? If they can, you have a problem, right? Maybe it's more complicated. It will take a little bit more work on their hands. Maybe it's not going to be an issue this year, but it eventually will be. So one thing I really like is if you're using cloud vendors like AWS, GCP, I assume Microsoft Azure would have the same type of features. There's ways you can store files with a lifecycle policy, which prevents those files from being deleted, even by someone with the utmost privileges. That way, you're sure that even if your most powerful level of access was compromised, the backups are not deletable, even with that level of access. And that kind of reminds me of when you hold a backup tape in your hands, ransomware can't just go and delete that until it's connected to something. We don't really have tapes anymore. So in the cloud, that's what I usually recommend if you're backing up to S3 or Google's GCS equivalent, to use those lifecycle policies to make sure it's completely undeletable.
I think your point's a valid one too, is how quickly can you reestablish things if you have a significant compromise across the entire network. To get every machine wiped and rebuilt again, it's going to take a long time.
For example, I've seen someone with really good backups have an issue with this, where the backups were on tape actually, so the backups were good, but the index to the backups got wiped, right? So if you have an entire room full of tapes and you need to restore from that, then the first step is you need to re-index all the tapes you're already going to be down for an extra 2-3 weeks, just because you're restoring that index or rebuilding that index instead of restoring it. So that's what I meant by a real worst case scenario.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of government, because I know that, for instance, the Biden administration recently has been talking a lot about cyber policy and making improvements there. What is the role, in your opinion, of the government in helping private and public companies? Megan, can we start with you?
Sure. I think there's, I would say, at least 2 or 3 roles that the government can play, and it probably sounds pat, but the first is in prioritizing and raising awareness. So raising awareness around the fact that cybersecurity is a real issue, and I think we've come a long way in the past few years in that case. I think the meeting at the White House yesterday of this group of CEOs is further evidence that this is no longer kind of further down on the government's as well as industry's prioritization list. Nonetheless, we're still talking about sort of the 1%ers. And so really the role of the government is to continue to use all of the tools that it has to make this a priority. And by that, I mean thinking about not only CISA, but also the Small Business Administration, the Department of Education. We need to bring, there are friends of ours who have said that cybersecurity is a team sport, and so we really need to bring all players from the government team to the table to help the rest of the economy really better manage this. There are, we have taken in the United States what we've called regulatory light approach to most kind of policy options in the cybersecurity space. There are requirements in certain sectors, but efforts to kind of have a general requirement around good cyber hygiene and good cybersecurity practices, I'll be sort of high level at that, failed in the past. And I think there's, since especially the events of the summer, Colonial Pipeline, other incidents of ransomware that have really kind of led the government to think about whether that's still the right approach. And so you see small measures to try and push the regulatory envelope. So you can think about TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, using its regulatory authority that it actually had to push forward on pipeline security. So I think we'll continue to probably see some of these light touch regulatory measures would be the second thing. So first, raising awareness, using regulatory measures where appropriate. And then the third, I think, is really this idea of capacity building. We have in the United States, there's, and we can probably talk later on about this announcement from yesterday's meeting that I mentioned, but we need to build capacity the organization that I work for focuses in particular on small businesses, journalists, elected officials, but there are a range of other entities that are not in the position to have the luxury of a room full of backups. In fact, you say to them a backup and they might look at you and say, what does that mean? I have an old, Seagate something or other over here that I haven't touched in 3 years. Is that what you mean? Right. So we need to build the capacity of them to do the basics, but also really to think about building capacity externally and internationally. And so that we do have countries, when there is an issue that's emanating from their jurisdiction, we can phone them up and say, this is the evidence, please help us. And they can say, right, we have the substantive and procedural laws to help you run this investigation. So I would offer those three.
Megan, I want to piggyback on that and ask you another quick question on that. How about funding, tax credits, things along those lines to help some of these small businesses? Any thoughts on that? Because I just share with you, I had an interesting conversation with a manufacturer who is part of the DoD supply chain, and with CMMC coming through on the regulation side, they actually said that they were looking at whether they wanted to continue to do business with the DoD because the cost associated with putting all those controls in place. And my conversation obviously went to, you need those things in place to protect your business no matter what, but it was a financial thing for them. Any thoughts on that side?
I would say personally, not a position of GCA. We tend not to take positions on these types of things. In the past, I've written about the need to think about funding measures. And so if you think in the kind of telecom space, there is the Universal Service Fund that has helped build out telecoms capabilities and inclusion across the United States. And there is a question about whether some of those resources could be used to help the cybersecurity capabilities of that build out. But do we need to kind of have this other fund that we stand up to help particularly those entities that can't afford to scrap the entire network and start over 3 days later to manage their risks? Now, is that risk of a smaller entity going to be so large? Maybe not, but nonetheless, we're talking about, in many cases, small businesses who really are actually the lifeblood of the economy, so they can't afford that. Two, I think, is this idea of a criticism, I guess I would offer of yesterday's laudable commitments by attendees, is this idea that we should have to pay for security in some cases. Now, high degree of security capabilities and rather complex capabilities, that makes sense. But the idea that this, giving away a token to support multi-factor authentication is a free giveaway, as opposed to something that should just be kind of guaranteed in the product lifecycle, and is one that I think we really need to think about whether that's the best approach going forward.
Yeah, great point. Bob, any thoughts on the topic?
I do have some thoughts. And one, I have seen so many good people in government work so hard to not only improve the resiliency of government networks, but to share information with folks commercially and help defend the enterprise there. It's a tough job. And I've seen people trying to do this tough job for decades. And whenever I see progress, I want to cheer these folks on, because it's tough making progress. But that said, your question here was, what's the role of government in helping protect companies? It's actually kind of limited. All these things the government is doing, it needs to do, and it needs to be unique, and it needs to keep trying to do more. But my advice to the CEO of companies is, don't expect the government is going to defend your network. You need to take full responsibility yourself to reduce your risk. And please, government, keep doing that stuff you're doing. We want a strong CISA. We want experts who can analyze stuff and share information. And we want a strong intel community to look at what the bad guys are going to do next. But no CEO should think the government is going to defend your network. In my opinion, you need to take personal responsibility and start to the greatest extent possible, learn the lessons that are already available to you on how to mitigate the risk to your enterprise. And I like to make that point when people talk about the role of government. I think the attitude of a CEO or leader should be, I need to defend my own stuff. I need to be personally responsible for it.
Very good. I agree 100%. Guillaume, I'm going to go to what you brought up, which I think is a really interesting part. Like, we talked about ransomware, but you brought up the extortion side of things that is occurring. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, asking for money so you get your data back is definitely one type of extortion, and the one we associate with ransomware the most. But another one that's been I think fairly common for many years is just denial of service, extortion, right? Like, oh, your nice website you got there, would be a shame if it was down for another 96 hours kind of thing. But we also see that happening over DNS, like domain names, right? People, that's a pretty interesting thing. Like a lot of companies start with someone buying a domain name, right? So they don't have a security team yet. They just go on some domain vendor. There's no two-factor authentication. They're using probably a personal email address because they don't already have a company domain. So there's a lot of companies that have grown and have very vulnerable domain names. And so what the attackers do is they transfer these domain names over. They don't change anything. Everything still works. And then you'll get ransom letter for getting control of the domain back, right? And if you don't, then it'll be pointed to anything else. And then lately with the ransomware ransom groups, we've seen the uploading of the data and the threatening of releasing that data. We've actually seen that in quite a few cases recently. One that comes to mind is I think it happened with one of the providers that Apple uses for manufacturing devices, and then we saw a bunch of leaks of like upcoming product information and all that. And I think that's going to become more and more common, because if people get good at the backups, then they can simply restore. And then how else are you going to extort them? Well, you need to find a different threat, essentially.
And so threatening to data leak the sensitive documents that they have, and they share a couple of examples and say, you can back up all you want, but we're going to release all of this if you don't pay.
And that's going to, I mean, the Sony hack was, I think, one of the first big ones where like everyone's emails were leaked, and it made people a little bit more nervous that was going to start happening more and more. But then ransomware business model was doing so well, they didn't necessarily have to change it. The interesting part, though, is I think that'll impact who the targets are, right? Because a lot of companies, integrity is more important than confidentiality to them, depending on the business you're in. But if you're in healthcare, for example, confidentiality of the patient records is not the same thing as if you're like a marketing company and your clients' ads are released a few weeks early. So that'll change the targets for sure.
It is interesting, though, on the data. If you do the data classification for pretty well every organization, when you're done that, there is all types of sensitive data that they wouldn't want to have, publicly disclosed. Bob, Megan, any thoughts on new tactics that you've seen happening?
I'll offer, Bob's being polite. I would just say, we've talked about double extortion, this idea that we're going to lock up your data and then expose it. I think the other thing, and I think Guillaume just sort of touched on this, but I might say it a different way, is to say, we talked about the integrity of data. Well, what about if your information is dumped, but it's actually manipulated before it's dumped? So this I think is still the authenticity of the data question is still one that we haven't quite seen, but I wouldn't, to Bob's early point, which is a great one, evolution is going to continue to happen. So how can they continue to evolve? This is one place where we might begin to see things. And so this idea of really ensuring that you do have some form of offline backup, but that's, we can talk about all the different buzzwords around the backup, cold storage, all these other things, but that gives you the opportunity to say, no, actually, here's how you verify that this is actually what the document said, if you ever have to be in that place. But the best position to be is not in that place in the first case. So Bob has more to say.
It's easy to know that you need to restore from backups when every computer is locked with a ransom notice. But what if someone starts slowly modifying small pieces and bits of data, and then you realize that 6 months down the road, then your backups from 6 months ago are no good for things like financial records and all that. So that's an interesting one for sure, as well as dumping things and modifying them slightly publicly.
And also modifying IoT controls, right? Changing the way that maybe healthcare medical systems are working, or critical infrastructure and so on, which could be that. Bob, did you want to share any thoughts?
I just want to say, I'm not a lawyer, but I always listen to them. And Megan, if you have an opinion on this, I'd love to hear it. And that is, what if there's an extortion and, well, first they encrypt your ransomware, you pay, you get your key back, you get your data back. Then they say, all right, I want a second bite of the apple. I'm going to release your data. If you don't give me $1 million, you don't do it. They release your data. Are you liable for GDPR fines? And are you liable for the California Consumer Privacy Act fines? And now the Virginia Privacy Act fines and the Colorado State Privacy Act fines? Do you have to pay all that stuff because the bad guys released all this PII info? I think these are big questions.
Yeah. we're going to talk a little bit about making the payments in a second. I want to share also that I think the cybersecurity community has been talking a lot about the insider threats, and that there's been some offers from these cyber attackers and these criminal gangs to like recruit people internally inside of companies to, you know, deploy the ransomware within and then share the payments too. So when we talk about different tactics and techniques, you know, recruiting an unhappy employee could be part of it as well, which adds a whole nother dynamic inside of an organization. Really scary thought. I know you've all been in cybersecurity for quite a while, and Guillaume, I know that you also mentioned to me that you might be willing to share some experiences, but I think it'd be beneficial if we could tell a couple stories about, you know, events, ransomware events that you've maybe been a part of and experienced, and what that looked and felt like. And Guillaume, do you want to go first on this?
Yeah, I would say in one of the big like ransomware events I've been a part of, either as a consultant or employee, one thing that really struck me is the speed at which things can happen once the credentials and the ease of lateral movement is obtained by the attackers. And so in 30 minutes, 40 minutes, you could easily go from everything looks fine to 10,000, 15,000, 25,000 computers are all infected and locked, right? So as soon as it starts happening, it's incredible the speed at which it will spread. And again, companies are so dependent on technology for everything, right? Including like most phones are voice over IP. They get their IPs from a DHCP server that runs Windows that got encrypted, and so it got wiped as well. So communicating in an international company when a massive ransomware attack happens is very difficult. So it's very, very important to have some out-of-band methods for reaching people in all the different offices. Otherwise, you're going to waste a few days in response just on that. But I would also say that when you're rebuilding, a huge amount of stress is placed on the teams, right? And managing those teams, you don't want everyone to just abandon and stop. You need to recover. So everyone's working super hard. But it's a strangely good team building experiment, I would say, because it's so intense that people really usually pull together and pull it off. But a huge source of stress is, what if it happens again, right? Like we think we know how it spread the first time, and we fix that as we're rebuilding. But there's always that little fear you have in the back of your head, which is, what if the attackers are still there and they knew of a second vulnerability they could use to spread laterally, and when we're done rebuilding after like 17 days, it just happens happens again. So that was a fear I've heard quite a few people express, because while you're rebuilding, of course, you try to make it more secure, but you're doing that in 2-3 weeks, right? Like you're not setting up a vastly different architecture. You're not going to change you're not going to do a digital transformation just because you're rebuilding every computer and restoring from backup. So I think managing the teams and human resources is very difficult in these times when it happens. But it's definitely doable, right? Like there's plenty of big companies that suffered major ransomware attacks and they've survived and they're doing well now.
Let's talk about the downtime. We just talked to a company the other day who was sharing with us that it took them, I think it was over 3 months for them to rebuild their systems and get back up to full capacity. Have you seen that type of?
Yeah, I've seen it take a long time. But usually you have like some critical services that you'll focus on, right? Oh, this is like customer facing. We'll start with that. So what you usually see is a long tail of issues, right? So all the customer stuff was back up after a few weeks, and then we've got these internal systems. Oh, this is still down. This is still broken. And then you even see like a year or two down the road, you still have issues caused from, oh, we rebuilt this super fast, and it's kind of a hack. It's not great. So there's a very long tail to some of these attacks, especially when they're the type of ransomware that just affects like every single computer that was in a company, which I guess now that we're working remote, especially if you don't have a VPN, that's maybe less frequent, knocking on wood.
Yeah, the fact that machine is air gapped, that's what you're talking about?
Just the fact that I'm not a fan of VPNs. I like when people are working remote and they use more of kind of a zero trust approach to reaching the different services that they need to use. And so the laptops can never talk to communicate with one another. So that way you force the attackers to take control of a management system instead of taking control of a laptop and using that to reach other laptops, right? Like it moves the attack surface to something you can more easily monitor and secure. Of course, if you're managing 10,000 laptops with a mobile device management system and someone takes that over, they will still be able to deploy ransomware to your 10,000 computers as fast, but at least it's one thing to worry about.
You and I chatted the other day, and you made a really interesting point where you're talking about the maturity of the organization and how like an early stage startup probably has a better opportunity to build strong cybersecurity compared to enterprise. Can you share a little bit on that?
That's the yeah. So if you don't have any legacy environment to secure, you can start thinking of how would you build things properly from the beginning, and that's on everything from backups to network architecture. And there's a lot of companies talk about zero trust in the security space, and it's almost become like a meaningless buzzword because it's used to mean almost anything and everything. But the reality is, for most companies, they have a huge environment. They typically always have Active Directory and a lot of Windows. Active Directory was released in like 2000. A lot of companies are still using the settings they were using on Active Directory when they upgraded from Windows NT, right? Because they always upgrade. And so if you built a brand new Active Directory using the latest version of Windows, it would be way more secure than what most people have because they only upgrade the previous versions. And I think that's probably quite a challenge for Microsoft, right? To try and bring people to these new settings that are better and keep like the compatibility layer. But when you have the chance of being in a greenfield environment, you just do things completely differently. So for example, our company is just turned 1 year old, and I've been here for like 51 weeks. Our infrastructure is designed as code, right? So it takes about 40 minutes to redeploy the entire infrastructure. You can't walk into an existing bank and hope to make that a reality in 10 years or even 20 years. It's just completely different. So I would say for most companies, software as a service is also a force multiplier in that aspect, right? How many companies would be in much more trouble if they weren't using something like Office 365 or Google Workspace, and were running their own infrastructure? So I think it's like, take advantage of what you have. If you're a huge enterprise with a lot of money, maybe you have a lot of experts, a huge security team. But if you're a smaller company, try to use the good, reputable software as a service where you can. Unfortunately, I find that the more specialized software as a service is, usually the less secure it is. But the generic ones are usually better than most companies can do in-house.
Right. Bob, you have any stories you'd be willing to share?
I do. And first, I want to say a comment, and that is, I heard Guillaume talk about some of the events that he's dove deep into in his past. And these are events that are backed, some of them, by very well-resourced adversaries with large development teams and lots of other capabilities besides just code writers. So this is the advanced persistent threat, the very high-end adversary. And those guys are out there, but there's also the criminal groups and those that don't have those many resources. And then there's the lower end people too. And I mention this full spectrum because I don't know, but it just seems every time I work with the company and they've had a ransomware attack, one of the first thing that the IT guys tell their bosses is, this was a very sophisticated attack. This is a very high-end adversary, more crafty than we could ever have imagined. And it's 100% of the time. That's what the IT and security guys seem to be saying to their bosses. They're not.
I don't know. I have never seen a security team tell that to their boss. I've seen plenty of PR teams tell that to the public, though.
Well, I have seen that frequently in the companies that I'm working with, and I don't want to put anybody on report, and I shouldn't. But these are the kind of conversations that occur at very senior executive levels, and I frequently have to come in and tell them that, this was a pretty average attack by an adversary that seems to be just common. And so I just mentioned that there is very high-end adversaries that are very sophisticated, and there's also just the average guys. And I believe we can do things in the enterprise for not too much of a budget that's going to make it much harder on the average guys. And maybe you won't keep the SolarWinds style attacker out, or the Hafnium group out, but maybe you'll make it so hard on everybody else that those are the only ones you have to worry about.
Megan, I got a question for you. If you pay the cyber criminals the ransom, it works, right? They give you the decryption code and it's all back to normal, right?
Fortunately and unfortunately, no. I think we mentioned previously the Colonial Pipeline attack, and I think the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, was pretty explicit in saying to folks in a more eloquent way than I'm about to say, look, folks, we got lucky. Don't expect this to happen again. And what I mean by that is that the Department of Justice, FBI, and whomever else it worked with were able to recover the ransom that was paid. But as a former colleague of mine who's still at the Department of Justice once said, remember, you're negotiating with criminals. Right. So in the case of ransomware, it behooves them to actually give you access back. But I can't remember if it was Bob or Guillaume who said, doesn't mean, and in many cases it does, that you won't be attacked in the future, that you won't be kind of re-victimized. And while that may be not in the interest of the actual criminal group, they are, as we know, frequent to kind of wind down and then stand up in a new, with a new fancy name, and continue to deploy tactics that have worked elsewhere. So I think that there are a lot of questions that need to be asked by an organization if they're considering paying a ransom. And one of the first is, do we have a backup? And have we tried to unlock the encrypted files? There's a website called nomoreransom.org that has a number. The number I think is, I want to say something, I won't get the number right, it's over hundreds of keys to unlock different types of ransomware. And there's also a resource that the US government has just put out called stopransomware.gov that similarly has resources. So I would encourage folks to we can talk more about this, but I don't want to hog the mic per se, but to think carefully before they decide to pay a ransom. And certainly we talked a little bit a few minutes ago about sort of what's the day in the life of a ransomware attack like. I think many enterprises now are in the position of having the benefit of considering a ransomware attack in their incident response plan. But again, I come from focusing on the underdog, so to speak, and I can pretty much guarantee that the underdogs don't have an incident response plan, and therefore they don't have an incident response plan that has, Exhibit 7, ransomware attack. Here's what we do. So I think, I do want to, as one of the former law enforcement folks on the conversation, say it's really important to report an incident to law enforcement. There are good mechanisms by which the government is not going to put you in the victim seat. And by reporting that and sharing details, you're able to help prevent further victimization of what may be your competition, but could also be part of your supply chain.
Yeah, and the FBI is getting involved in helping when things are occurring as well. So sharing that can be beneficial. I want to move on and just talk a little bit about the role of cybersecurity insurance providers. I know that's been a big conversation as well lately, especially since sometimes they're paying the ransom. Anyone want to share some thoughts on the insurance side? Go first. No?
All right, I'll go. I'm not an insurance specialist, but funny enough, I see in the list of participants, I'm not going to name him because I don't know if he would want me to, but an insurance broker I've worked with is in the audience right now. And what I will say is, if you're looking to get cyber insurance right now, you have to find a broker that gets it, and you need to have, especially if you're like in the cloud and you're a pretty modern organization, you need to have someone that's going to listen to the different controls that you have, even if they're not on the standard list, because it's getting more and more difficult. They're asking more and more questions, and you can see from the questions that you'll get that they're probably not making that much money with cyber insurance in the last few years, because there's just so many attacks, right? So you're selling a policy, and the odds are just completely just against you. So personally, I wouldn't be surprised if we just saw cybersecurity stop being offered by many vendors, or just like big exclusions for ransomware specifically. Though then the definition of ransomware versus extortion and all that would become quite a hot topic. I would say, but I'm happy to see that the insurers are trying to ask the right questions. The questions I see now are much better than like 6 years ago, for example, when like ransomware was starting to be a concern, but it would be like, do you have backups? Okay, yes, good enough. Here's a policy. So now it's more focused on the reality.
Even that, you sometimes the old ones used to just be, what's your revenue, how many employees, and how many locations, and it was like didn't get too deep. Maybe a couple security controls, but yeah, really basic. We've had quite a few conversations with organizations today who are saying that their cybersecurity insurers are saying they're not going to continue to insure them, and asking them again to go back through questionnaires and deep dives, and you know, those organizations are realizing they may have to invest more into that. How about the fact that, you know, the insurance companies are making payments and the ransom side of things? Like if that didn't exist, you know, what would happen? Anybody have any thoughts on that as a topic?
I do. And let me say, I think when you're in cybersecurity, you have a couple choices you have to make. You can either look at all the threats and the gloomy stuff out there and become very depressed and a pessimist and it's all gloom and doom, or you realize that there are things you can do to make it harder on the bad guys. And it's tough, but you're going to be able to do it, and you're going to get optimistic. And I've always, for the last 20 years, been on that optimistic side. But here's maybe where that has steered me wrong. Sometimes I become naive and hopeful. And it was that way with me about 15 years ago as these conversations started about insurance. And I still, to this day, am hopeful that there'll be something good there, but it hasn't worked out yet. It has really, I think, had a negative effect. It's made things worse because you have these insurance guys out just, it's like a gold rush trying to write policies. And then some of them will do things like they'll have favorite forensic investigators to come in after an incident, or some of them will have you take some steps to be a little bit more secure or be in compliance with some regime, but they're not helping that much. And then they're not stopping the ransoms from being paid. So they're going to have to raise all their rates to where you'll pay them more than you would pay a ransom. And the insurance companies themselves, as proof that they do not understand this threat, they get hit by ransomware. The largest ransom ever paid in history was paid by who? An insurance company that focuses on writing ransomware insurance policies. Something is just totally wrong here. It was CNA Financial. They paid a $40 million ransom, and they're thinking that they can insure everybody else. So I'm still an optimist. There's going to be good here, but I'm very let down on the status of things after decades of us trying to get this right.
Right. I think that there's not a gold rush right now to sign cybersecurity coverage anymore. Like it's the opposite. And I think what's going to happen is, if you're a company with a lot of legacy environments, it's going to become harder and harder and more expensive. And the good that might come of that is, at some point, it might push people towards re-architecting things in a more secure way. But again, this is stuff for, you know, the rich companies with security experts and a lot of IT people. Doesn't really help like a SMB with 1 to 100 employees, unfortunately.
Right. I wanted to share too that, you know, at times I've heard from organizations say, well, I have cybersecurity insurance, so why do I need to put, you know, cybersecurity controls in place? And we like to use the analogy about driving your car. So you still put your seatbelt on, you drive safely, but you have the insurance coverage if something bad happens. You know, you definitely don't want to not put controls and protection in place, you know, in favor of just having a cybersecurity insurance policy, because as we've been sharing here, you know, a downtime can be pretty significant, and that can have some serious losses. Let's go to this one, which is a fun one to talk about, and I know that we might debate back and forth a little bit on this one, but you know, just to start off with, like, the Department of Treasury here in the U.S., you know, has made it pretty clear that some of these ransomware payments, you know, might be being paid to some sanctioned organizations. It, you know, could be against federal law to even do that. But there's also a concept around, you know, if you made it illegal, then ransomware would just stop. You know, if it was illegal to pay an attacker, then they wouldn't launch it anymore. Megan, do you have any thoughts on that or any of these topics?
I think the question of making payments is one that as you mentioned is really come back to the conversation just over the summer. I think it was France that said that they would no longer allow payments to be made by, or if it was a carrier in France. But the challenge, of course, is outlawing it in one jurisdiction, so to speak, isn't really going to be too effective because, like so many other things, you squish the bug here and it kind of runs elsewhere. So I think there's a question of whether kind of the first mover principle applies in making payments illegal. Of course, one country starts and others might follow. I think too, this issue of the recommendation of the task force was not that we immediately make payments illegal. That doing so will actually probably put a tremendous amount of pressure on those who are not in a good position in the first place. And that we would see the attackers, so to speak, looking to really push the limit, push the envelope and say, oh, really, you said you weren't going to pay this payment, but now I have a hospital locked up and I live in South Carolina. That would be really, really bad. Are you going to stick to your principles? So instead, we recommended that we begin to take a couple of steps to put us on a pathway toward making payments illegal. And the first of those is to think about making sure that we have enough information out there and that we've really made it as accessible as possible for companies to know what to do to try to prevent ransomware and then how to respond to it. And that could be through a couple of opportunities, including one that's already underway through the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is this ransomware framework. So let's really give to companies an actual set of recommendations that they can undertake. Will be mapped to the controls the CIS, the Center for Internet Security, develops, and put them on the pathway to being in a better position. Of course, then we can come back to this issue of incentives. Well, great, we all know that we should use multi-factor authentication. We should put on our seatbelt. We should wash our hands. We should use. You can decide. We can debate whether it's good to use password protection. We know that we should segment networks. All these things. So much of this is known. So it really does come back down to incentives. And again, I think there's a pathway that we could consider as opposed to just saying, right, effective December 31st, it shall now be illegal. So it's a tool to consider, but one that needs to be not done in a vacuum.
Do you think, like I was just thinking, would there be the equivalent of tax havens for ransomware payments if it became illegal pretty quick, where companies making all their profit in this foreign country so they don't pay any taxes over here, then they would have a small office somewhere just to do the ransomware payment or something like that. I think it would people would definitely try to find loopholes once it's either that or you just simply close the company. So.
Yeah, and again, so what if we make the investment up front, right? Do we need to be thinking about tax havens and where we can try and move money around if we don't instead decide that this is a priority? And back to kind of the earlier comments of what's one of the roles of government and what's one of the roles of kind of industry. And I think really, we'll begin to see, I think, closer attention being paid also by the exchanges, both in the United States and elsewhere, around how these measures are, how these payments are made public and accounted for.
Great. Anybody else have a thought?
I have a comment, and that is, first of all, Megan, I think that was well thought out, logical, rational. I'm on board. I think those are good thoughts. Now, I have a maybe an illogical thought, but it comes from the heart, and that is this. What if instead of making ransomware payments illegal, we say, fine, it's legal, but whatever your ransomware payment is, you must make the exact same amount of payment to the Global Cyber Alliance, because the money that you're sending to the bad guys is funding their future R&D and causing them to evolve and become more evil in the future, hurting humanity. So you must make the exact same amount of payment to the Global Cyber Alliance, because they're the good guys and they're going to use that money to build defenses that will help us all. Now, I know there's a lot of issues with that, but it comes from the heart.
I love it.
Appreciate it. The only thing I would say about that too is, we probably don't have time to talk about it now, but this idea that ransom payments are actually funding a lot of bad stuff, to put it plainly and politely. And I think, we are expecting to see a lot of, hopefully, more information coming out about kind of where this money goes. And I would think that companies who are, publicly traded entities wouldn't want to be seen as kind of supporting WMD research and some of the other bad things that Bob has mentioned.
Right. All right, I'm going to put everybody on the spot for a second and ask for everyone to provide I know that one tip each isn't enough to solve the ransomware problem, but maybe let's get one tip from each person. And then we're going to share some free resources that all the panelists have sort of come up with that they wanted to provide everybody who's attending the webinar. So let's go with one tip first. Bob, you want to go first with the tip?
Well, I hope this doesn't steal any of Megan's thunder, because it is something that Global Cyber Alliance is an advocate for. And that is figure out how to put DNS configuration on your side. If you are a small business, there's a free way that you can configure how the internet routes information around. It's called DNS, and you only have to do it once, and you sort it out. And then it's like having a magic firewall in the internet that makes it harder on the bad guys to communicate. If they get malware into your system, then that malware wants to communicate. And if it has to go through a DNS firewall, it can't do that. It really slows down the bad guys. So Quad9 is the name, it's the brand of a free nonprofit DNS service that I think every small business should use. Larger businesses can access many other resources that do that. For the small business, I'd say Quad9. So I would say go to quad9.net, read up on how to configure your DNS, and use that to help make it a little bit harder on the bad guys to communicate with malware in your system.
Fantastic. Guillaume, you got a tip for everybody?
Yeah, to me, I've got two. I'm going to cheat. So the first one is more about backups, right? Like really threat model your backups, find every way someone could get rid of your backups and fix those issues one by one. But that works against ransomware, which encrypts data, right? Like if you have other types of extortion where the data gets uploaded somewhere, the backups aren't really going to help you around that. But I'm a huge fan of just real network segmentation and making workstations unable to communicate with one another. It works great, and you don't need to buy anything to do that. Every operating system comes with a firewall. Like for example, Windows Firewall can be configured via group policies in an enterprise, prevent laptops from seeing one another. And that's a very good first step against ransomware. Also, it reduces the noise, right? So if something suspicious happens, you have more chances of seeing that and paying attention to it, because you've just removed a lot of kind of junk traffic going on.
Great. Megan?
MFA, multi-factor authentication. So now you can come back and say, wait a minute, you're expecting me to put MFA throughout my enterprise? Are you crazy? That's going to take me X number of days, weeks, years. But then I think it comes back to another principle that we've been talking about this afternoon, which is really thinking about your risk profile and looking at what are the highest risk avenues, pathways into your network. I was talking to a former colleague this morning who is working with a client who became a victim of ransomware via their VPN. There was not MFA deployed on the VPN. And back to Guillaume's point about not liking a VPN, we can have that conversation at a future webinar. But I'm also going to drop in the chat, in addition to some of the other resources I shared, another piece that we put together about some of the basics. And I think that's really what it comes back to is we can think about basics in smaller enterprises and in larger ones, but network segmentation, it may be difficult to deploy or challenging to deploy, but it's a key resource. Similarly, multi-factor authentication. Bob mentioned using a protective DNS service. I would say, back to steal the kind of last minute word, do something, right? Don't just sit there and do nothing.
I was going to share as a tip, maybe not to get too technical, but just to say, if you're a non-IT technical leader, maybe the CEO or the CEO or the CFO of your business, if you're not doing this today, you need to be having a sit-down conversation with your IT teams and so on around the concept of cybersecurity. This is a business risk. It's not necessarily just an IT risk, and you should be having that conversation every day. We've got like 1 minute left, and I have some free resources that you folks were kind enough to share. So let's go through them really quickly. I don't think you need to get too detailed, but maybe Guillaume, do you want to go first and just tell us about these quickly?
Yes, Microsoft LAP stands for Local Administrator Password Solution. It just lets you randomize the local administrator password on all your Windows machines connected to a domain. So they're all different. So someone who manages to crack one can't use that to spread laterally. And then Microsoft has a really good guide on credential theft mitigation. So if you have a pretty big company with an IT team that has some Active Directory skills, I would highly recommend looking at that to mitigate the risk of lateral movement. OS Query, it's an open source project. You can think of it kind of as an EDR tool with an open data format. Makes it awesome to interrogate endpoints and know what's going on and detect lateral movement and different things like that. So I've got a conference there on YouTube where I map OS Query to the Mitre attack framework that Rob mentioned earlier. Velociraptor, similar tool, another great open source tool. So that's all free stuff. And then No More Ransom Project, which Megan mentioned before. If you're, I was going to say lucky, it's not really lucky, but let's say if you're not bad lucked enough to get ransomware that has good keys and can't be recovered, then it's probably going to be on No More Ransom.
Thank you. Megan, we've got some up here from you. Maybe, yeah, I think it's important to share what you folks do in regards to the free resources for sure.
Sure. So one thing I dropped in the chat will take you to the small business toolkit and other toolkits that we offer. DMARC is basically an email security protocol, as it says there, that reduces your and others' likelihood of phishing. It's not a silver bullet, but if we have more entities deploying DMARC on their networks, we'll have less opportunity for people to use, among other places, to squat and to use phishing campaigns to successfully deploy ransomware. Quad 9, Bob mentioned, it's a protective DNS service. AID is a resource that we have. It's an automated IoT defense ecosystem. So we're collecting a lot of data around attacks on malicious attacks on IoT devices and looking to see what can be ascertained about among other things, the effectiveness of policy tools. So no hard-coded passwords. What do we see in the data about how often that's used? So we're running some analysis there. And last is Domain Trust, which is a platform that offers collection distribution of malicious domain information. So again, stay tuned. We're hopeful to do some digging, as I say, into our own data to think about or to see whether or not we see indications of C2 command and control domains involved in that and what we can do to be useful to the community and trying to share that information.
Thank you. That's great. Over to you, Bob. You've got a couple of great sources here as well.
Yeah, 2 resources for people that want to continue to learn about the dynamic threat environment. This is the geopolitical threat environment, the cyber threat environment, but also the future of technology trends and where the convergence of all these interesting technologies is taking us. One, our daily OODA Daily Pulse report. Every day, that's a free newsletter published at our OODAloop.com site. And then also we do a podcast, and this is both a audio podcast available in any podcast directory or on YouTube. Just search for OODAcast.
Excellent. And I'll close it up by saying you can head off to defendify.io. We have 3 free tools you can download called the Essentials. And within it, you can get a threat alerts engine that provides you some threats in regards to vulnerabilities, phishing attacks, and so on. You can run an external network vulnerability scan on your network. And you can also actually perform a questionnaire-based cybersecurity assessment against a number of different controls that map to NIST and Center for Internet Security and so on. But just to summarize, I want to say thanks to everyone. I think it was a really great conversation. I think the resources at the end are beneficial to everyone. Thanks so much for joining me.
Good seeing you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.